You lazy son of a bitch, what's taking so long?
Dragon Age 2 is an RPG made by Bioware where you play as Hawk the champion of Kirkwall, and go on adventures throughout a decade with a merry band of misfits, who end up unwittingly changing the world of Thedas. This game follows on the events of Dragon Age Origins, which had you fighting a blighted Darkspawn and slaying an archdemon as the hero of Ferelden. But that story ended pretty nicely, with only a few lingering questions. So instead of Bioware continuing the story of the hero of Ferelden, they decided to go with an entirely new protagonist, being Hawk, with a slightly smaller scale story. The reason for this might be that EA basically told them, it took you nearly 7 years to make Origins? Yeah, make the sequel in 16 months please, thanks. Bioware magic is back, and worse than ever. This led to some issues, one being that choices in the game don't feel as impactful as they did in Origins, and they had to heavily reuse a lot of stuff. You'll mostly see this in the same level layout being used over and over again as you play the game. Bioware pushed this as far as they could because they kinda had to. Remember, they only had 16 months, which is a crazy short amount of time for game development. And to make a game of this size, I can only imagine the kind of stress Bioware devs were going through trying to make this game. But somehow Bioware managed to make the game in the crazy short amount of time, with what I feel is a fairly good story at its core, with great companions. So they still have that going for them at this point. But before we dive into that, let's get into the technical stuff. Settings might not be in depth enough for some, but they are good enough to get the job done. The only thing that was annoying in setting up the game was having to log into the Origins storefront. Ew. Other than that, the game ran mostly perfect. I had 0 crashes through my entire playthrough. It feels weird saying that now after having so many crashes in Origins. Feels like I'm gonna jinx it somehow. Oops. I mean, there was this one loading bug that I thought was loading indefinitely, and I pressed escape and it loaded. So not much of an issue. It's a big stability improvement from Origins. One of the reasons for this better performance was how the game's looks were changed in this sequel. It looks very different, but not in a bad way. It's just simpler than I think people were expecting the sequel to look, and at least it's not as brown as Origins was.
Kirkwall's not brown enough for me. But hey, no Darkspawn.
The change of visuals was for multiple reasons, not just EA's lack of the concept of time, but also so Bioware could inject more action into the game and have it run a bit better. When getting into production of the game, they made this cool animatic of where they wanted to go visually with the game, which looks pretty awesome and was really leaning on the dark fantasy setting. The new style they were going for had some influences from the visuals of Yojimbo and the Conan movies, which I can kinda see and does give the game a bit more of a unique look compared to the blandness of Dragon Age Origins. You can really see this with some of the character design changes, like Flemeth, who goes from old hermit lady to badass dragon sorcerer supreme. She wasn't the only one to get a redesign, as you may have noticed the Darkspawn look a little different from those in Origins. Some people got iffy about the redesigns, but in my opinion, while the character models lost a bit of detail, they look way more stylized. Though it's maybe a little too simplistic. Like, I don't hate it, and I actually kind of prefer this look compared to the Origins, but it feels like it's missing something.
Do you ever feel like the world's getting simpler? Like everything from eating to fighting is a lot less complex than it used to be?
Another reason this change was made was so the game could run better on consoles, which it did, but it led to other problems, which I'll get into later. Everything visual has been simplified a lot, and not just the art style. The UI, which had a very fancy vibe in Origins with codex and character details in the form of old weathered books and nicely detailed ability portraits, has now been changed to something you probably find in a mobile game, which makes the UI easy to understand and use and isn't absolutely terrible, but I do miss the original style of the Origins UI. It added to the feel of the game for me, and they could have kept a little of that while still improving the UI. Voice acting in the game is great, and it's not just the NPCs talking this time around, as your character is voiced now.
My name's Hawk.
Unlike Origins, where you had to imagine what your character sounded like, which I'll admit is fun for role-playing, but it was more fun for me to hear Hawk's character be sarcastic in a British accent.
Whoever's hiding had better come out. Unless you're a dragon. Then feel free to keep hiding.
On a little tangent, talking about accents quick. In the previous game, they set up the different cultures and people with fairly distinct accents. So you get a sense of where they're from, which they continue in Dragon Age 2, which is a nice touch. Like Fereldans and Free Marchers generally have British accents with some American ones occasionally mixed in.
My farm supplied eggplant half of the South Reach. Yeah? My eggplant supplied half the bastards in South Reach.
But the American accent is generally more used for the dwarves.
I keep thinking I'll fall up into that sky any minute.
Dwarves are funny.
The Orlesians have a very French accent, which I enjoy a fair bit, even when they are being a bit insulting.
He won't tell me who he's working with. Who else has been screwing me over? Tell me, you ratting mongrel.
Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt of elderberries.
In Origins, the Dalish were a mix of different ones, but in Dragon Age 2 they decided to make them aggressively Welsh and Irish.
Watch your steps, Yam. You don't know how many Dalish arrows are trained on you right now.
The different accents are great and they help with making the world feel bigger, and you almost get an automatic sense of where the character is from. Okay, back on topic. Music in the game is pretty good too. It nails the tone for all the different settings in the game. From fairly chilled tavern music, which plays whenever you go to the hangman, to the intimidating Qunari chanting, which would even put some Klingon music to shame. And even the theme for the Templars, which for some reason reminds me of spaghetti western music, but with some fantasy thrown in. All the music helps sets the mood perfectly for this more action-packed RPG, which now has much faster attack animations which are fun to watch, though it's still trying to be an isometric RPG and it doesn't quite work. It has the fast animations for an action game, but has the inputs for a pause and play RPG. So while everything is fast, you still just click on an enemy once and start automatically attacking, and use a skill every so often. It feels too detached to be an action game while somehow being a little too fast to be a pause and play one. It's an odd mix. It caused problems for Bioware, mostly on the PC side, because these changes were made more for console players than the PC ones. Also, the way you kill enemies at times is pretty ridiculous, even for a fancy game. Like, you hit enemies with such force at times they get splattered, like something out of the Boys TV series. The game feels easier than Origins too, like you can get away without pausing for a large amount of the battles. You don't really need to think tactically most of the time, so pausing time to plan ahead to use different skills isn't required as much, except for a few boss fights and the DLCs. This felt very similar to how the combat felt when I played it on console. So you'll only be slightly annoyed with the reduced ability to zoom out, which is now way less than the nice zoom in Origins. Like now it's either normal third person view or slightly more distant third person view. I do miss the ability to zoom out a greater distance, as there are a few times when combat finally gets serious and I wanted to get a better view of the situation. Because I only played this on console before now, it wasn't so apparent why PC players were so annoyed with the lack of a more isometric perspective. But now I get it, as I kept wanting to zoom out more but the game wouldn't let me. Come on, just a bit more, come on. Oops. Also, the combat being easier isn't a huge issue for me, as you can turn up the difficulty if you want the fights to last a bit longer. The problem for me was the quality of most combat encounters, as most fights are forgettable. Like 90% of the fights, all you need to do is focus on the enemy mage or rogues, as they do the bulk of the damage, and just mop up the rest of the enemies after that. You don't need to worry too much about positioning or skill selection. It gets fairly repetitive. There are exceptions with some boss fights and higher level monsters, but those are few and far between. Also, because most enemies are so easy to beat, there needs to be more spawned in, so combat can last past a few seconds. This led to it being very noticeable when enemies do spawn in, almost out of thin air, which does break immersion a fair bit. Okay, so I've been a bit negative about combat so far. To be fair, let's look at some positives. One thing I did like was the combo system, which if you get right you can do a large amount of damage, and it feels fairly satisfying to do. Basically, if you or one of your party members manage to get a specific status effect on the enemy, and then another member of your party follows up with a specific skill that takes advantage of that status effect, it gives a lot of bonus damage. The system also encourages you to keep a nice mix of classes in your party, as you need the other classes' abilities to trigger the combos. At the start of the game it'll be harder to get the combos going, but once you unlock more skills with the combos in mind, it gets a lot easier to pull off. What will make it even easier to pull off is the tactical menu, which lets you set up how your party members use their skills and when to use them. It helps having to micromanage the party less if you're into that. You can set it up so they use a specific combo skill on an enemy with the right status effect, and boom, you'll be doing combos all day. Also, Bioware did listen to feedback about the combat after the game's release, and tried to make encounters better and more varied in the DLCs for the game. In fact, they may have gone maybe a little too far in making things challenging in a few cases. Okay, so now the game doesn't look exactly like it used to, and it plays a fair bit differently from Origins. Did they keep anything that worked from the previous game? Yes, probably the most important thing in my opinion for a Bioware game, and that's the great storytelling and interesting characters. The game doesn't have as many big story choices like Origins, but there are still a few good ones in there, but they're mainly to do with your companions. They do at least try and keep the illusion of choice going in the main story. Also, they try to give choices on how to shape your character Hawk by giving some personality dialogue choices, with options being helpful, sarcastic, and aggressive, which affects how they interact with others in some cutscenes. In my opinion, sarcastic Hawk is the best Hawk.
A dragon fell from the sky, charred some darkspawn, then asked me to bring you this amulet. No big deal.
Though they had to narrow down the character creation choices to get the game done, so you can't play as an elf or dwarf this time around. Remember, only 16 months. You can only play as a human now, which makes sense for the story and production constraints, but coming from Origins does feel like a downgrade, though at least you still have 3 classes to pick from, being warrior, mage, and rogue. The game is a bit more interesting story-wise if you play as a mage, though the combat is easier playing as a mage, as you can attack from distance and have your choice of AoE spells to deal with large mobs, and can heal yourself. Also, the story bends a lot of rules in order to let you play as a mage, since mages in this world generally get locked up by Templars, who are basically the mage police. They lock mages in these places called circles because of the possibility of demon possession, and using blood magic, which is a big taboo, as it's used for some pretty bad stuff usually. But Hawk won't get locked up no matter how much magic they use in front of the Templars, which usually when Templars see a mage outside the circle will get their swords out while shouting, "Apostate something something." It's pretty strong plot armor, and the Templars in Kirkwall are way stricter than your average Templars too. Though in most of this world, the mage circles are almost nice white collar prisons, which still sucks as mages tend to have far less freedoms than other people in this world. There are exceptions to this like Devinter, which is a nation ruled by mages, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, in Kirkwall, the Templars converted a place called the Gallows, where slaves were held in the distant past, to a mage circle, and they didn't change the architecture much even after a few hundred years, which gives you a strong sense of how Templars in Kirkwall view mages. You get introduced to this dynamic of Templars versus mages the moment you arrive in Kirkwall, with murals of slaves and seeing how mages and Templars interact in this setting.
You're from Ferelden. What's the circle like there?
Well, funny story about that. Nearly every quest involves this tension between mages and Templars and shows the different points of view and why things are getting more heated between them. It's a vicious cycle that you see grow out of control as the game progresses. Also, like Origins, this game is good at setting up stuff that will happen in the future, which I really like. For me, it's pretty cool when something I see mentioned in a codex entry or side conversation comes up later. It's great world building and storytelling. Though unlike Origins, the story feels smaller and more focused, which I mean makes sense. Bioware had very little time to mess around, where Origins was setting up a world which had layers of lore and lots of big but intertwined stories that were all interesting. Dragon Age 2 didn't have all the time for that. It makes sense from a developer point of view, but to fans who are expecting something more like Origins, I can see why this game was a bit of a letdown. We got spoiled a bit with how much was in Origins. To make an obvious comparison, Origins is like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It covers events that are shaping entire kingdoms and maybe the end of the world, while Dragon Age 2 would probably be considered more the Hobbit-sized adventure, even if they are stuffing in extra things to make it bigger. I mean, there are things that are leading to bigger events, but like The Hobbit, Dragon Age 2's story ends before that stuff gets started. Now, I'm not saying Dragon Age 2's story is bad, I actually think it's pretty good. It's just the scale of the story is different to maybe what some were expecting at the time. I actually wouldn't mind more smaller scale stories like this from Bioware, but without the Bioware magic and false expectations that come from calling something a direct sequel. Another way to put it is this game is a good prequel to Inquisition, but a not so good sequel to Origins. Like, it's really good at setting stuff up that happens in Inquisition, so much that I'd say you should probably play this before you play Inquisition, as a lot of events and characters from Dragon Age 2 get set up to play a significant part in Inquisition. Talking about characters, Bioware nailed it again with the ones they created in this game. They are a great feature to the game. Now, you probably won't like all the characters, Carver, but you'll have strong positive or negative feelings about them either way, which means Bioware is doing its job of getting you to care. Top of the list of characters is Varric, a roguish dwarf who acts pretty sly, and is good at telling stories with some slight embellishments.
I can't believe you found it. This sounds exactly like the sort of fake thing I'd make up about you.
He's pretty charming and probably the most likable of all the characters. Aveline, another companion, is level-headed and stern. She was a former officer in the Ferelden army and is good at taking charge when needed, while looking out for others. She kinda acts like your moral compass when you need it, but she's also a big softie once you get to know her. Probably the polar opposite of her is Isabella, a pirate captain who is, free-spirited. She lives in the moment and doesn't like rules too much, while being a little selfish and will encourage you to have some fun. So having Aveline and Isabella in the same party will only lead to great things. Seeing these two interact with each other is some of the best moments in this game.
Can I call you Captain? You can call me Captain.
I won't be doing that.
Neither will I, because you're a guard captain. No real authority. Not like on a ship.
Well, you would know about having a large number of men under you.
You've been waiting to use that one. Did you practice?
Shut up.
Like, I can't tell if they truly hate each other or are the best of friends, just taking jabs at each other.
Other children used to laugh at me for having ginger hair.
Really? Oh, I bet you were cute. Did you have pigtails?
Sometimes.
How precious. Little Aveline running around the village with her flaming orange pigtails streaming behind her. And little boys all scattering and screaming for mercy as she approached.
Shut up, whore.
Another interesting character is Meryl. She's a Dalish elf mage and a little hard to describe. Like when Dragon Age concept artist Matt Rhodes was given a description of her, he drew her like this, but in the game she ended up looking like this. Meryl is both extremely sweet and adorable while sometimes being pretty scary. She has some of the most fun dialogue in my opinion.
You should leave too, but don't go that way. There's this huge dragon.
Oh, are we gonna go that way? I've never seen a huge dragon before.
Another elf who might join you is Fenris, who is a former slave and very much in touch with his emotions, especially his angry ones. Then there's Anders, a mage who was once part of the Grey Wardens. He has some issues. If you've played Awakening's expansion for Origins, you get more of his backstory, especially about his cat. Maybe I'll cover that expansion one day. But let's just say for now, apart from being a mage Grey Warden, he also merged with a spirit of justice that causes him to act a little extreme at times. Oh, and I haven't said anything about Hawk's sibling yet. When you start the game, Hawk will have two siblings, but one will always die before you get to Kirkwall, depending on your class choice. The reason this was done is to amp up the family drama as you go through the story, also to encourage multiple playthroughs. Each sibling is pretty different from each other. Bethany is kind, supportive, and very aware that the Hawk family had to make sacrifices in order to hide the fact that she was a mage from Templars. And Carver is, Carver. Let's just say Bioware really nailed the annoying younger brother role with him.
You're the eldest. You lead by default.
I don't see you taking the reins.
When should I do that? When I'm following you around, or when I'm caring for Mother while you tame mighty Kirkwall? Besides, we both know what happens when someone leaves dear sister's protection. I'm sure Bethany would appreciate that you're keeping good humor.
That's pretty much the lineup of companions. Oh wait, there's still Sebastian, the DLC companion. But everyone forgets about Sebastian. He's like Jacob from Mass Effect 2. Like the previous Bioware games, you'll do companion-specific quests and get to know them more. But this is where Dragon Age 2 did something different from Origins. Instead of an approval system from Origins, we now have a friendship rivalry system, which was Bioware's attempt at making a system where you didn't need to always agree with whatever your companions liked or disliked, or throw a million gifts at them to unlock more of their story. I mean, there still are companion gifts in the game, but they are few and far between, so you can't max out friendship or rivalry with them. It works like this: if you say or do something they like, you get friendship points and you become more friendly with each other. But if you say something they don't like, you get rival points, which means they kinda hate you a little, but they still respect you. Getting the friendship or rival bar high enough will lead to more companion side stories and some combat bonuses, which is nice. This system I found allowed me to stick to what my character choices were mostly, without having to lose a companion relationship unless you don't bring them along on quests. It was a step in the right direction, but it has its own flaws, such as you only get a large portion of your friendship rivalry points if your companion is on a quest with you. So you might not get enough points to max out the friend rival bar and might swap out party members not because they are the best choice for a quest, but because you want to get a few extra points to unlock companion stuff, which is some of the best content in the game. An easy fix for this would be to just make it that companions don't need to be in the party when you make a biggest choice that affects the friendship rivalry system. It would make sense from a role-playing perspective too, because people would hear about the things you've done and your companions are more likely than others to talk about you with each other. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the story in more detail, so if you don't want spoilers, skip to here. Still here? Cool. Okay, so the story starts with Varric, who's being interrogated by Cassandra, a member of the Seekers of Truth. Basically, the Seekers have supreme authority to investigate all things involving the Chantry, but mainly focus on keeping Templars in check. Something big has happened and Cassandra is sure your player character Hawk is somehow guilty of it. Cassandra needs details on Hawk's past, and Varric, being a friend of Hawk, seems like the only one she can get what she hopes is reliable information about them. So with some subtle persuasion, she gets Varric to tell the backstory of Hawk, which takes us all the way back to the Battle of Ostagar, which happened near the start of Origins. You know, the one where King Kalen and the Grey Wardens die fighting the Darkspawn and Loghain does the whole betrayal thing. The aftermath of that has the Hawk family trying to escape Lothering because now there's a huge army of Darkspawn coming. Now the most important question you may be thinking is, do I get a dog again? Yes you do. While you're on the run, your character Hawk meets Aveline and her soon to be departed husband, who is a Templar, and questions why either you or Bethany are using magic outside the circle. But don't worry about that, he's going to die. Another death that happens on the road fleeing the Darkspawn is either one of your siblings, which would have had more dramatic weight if I got to know them a bit more before this point. But don't worry, your remaining family will remind you they exist for the rest of the story, which might encourage you to do another playthrough to discover that you dislike Carver.
Do you think you're that interesting?
I have enough trouble being overshadowed as it is.
Shut up.
Now while you're fighting the Darkspawn, whose numbers keep increasing to the point where it looks like you won't make it, a dragon swoops in and saves you, and it turns out the dragon is Flemeth, the mother of Morrigan from Origins, showing off her makeover to badass Dragon Sorceress Supreme. Flemeth strikes a bargain with Hawk, where if Hawk just delivers an amulet to the Dalish near Kirkwall, Flemeth will provide safe passage for them. With no real other option, Hawk agrees, and eventually after a cutscene journey across the sea arrives in Kirkwall with their family and Aveline. Kirkwall isn't very welcoming, as they say they can't take any more Ferelden refugees who are all running from the the Blight currently happening. This is where your sketchy Uncle Gamlin, who lives in Kirkwall, helps basically set you up in indentured servitude for a year just to pay off your entry into Kirkwall. After a time skip of about a year or so, which this game maybe does too much of, you start the first act of 3, which covers significant events leading to why Cassandra is questioning Varric. And I'm not quite sure why the devs decided to make the gap between each act like years apart instead of maybe months, because not much actually changes in those biggish time skips, as the city and characters mostly stay the same, just the time of day in which each act is set is changed. Even your companions mock these time skips by saying stuff like,
"Hello, Hawk."
That's it?
What? Oh, right. Sorry. It feels like we just talked.
Okay, back to the main plot. While Hawk did manage to get their family into Kirkwall, they are living in the slums with Uncle Gamlin, just to make ends meet. So now Hawk is trying to get their family out of poverty, which is when you first meet Varric, who convinces you to go on a potentially lucrative expedition into the Deep Roads with him and his brother. Though there's a catch. There's always a catch. You need to raise funds in order to buy a share in the expedition, and it ain't cheap. So time to grind some quests to raise the necessary gold and maybe find some maps of the Deep Roads too. As you go and quest in the city, you may notice the escalating tensions between mages and Templars that might get you invested in siding with one of them. Also, while doing all this questing, you'll deal with family problems too, like with either Bethany worrying about being caught by Templars as she's technically an apostate outside the circle, or Carver, who's pretty much an ass most of the time. Oh, and you find out your shady uncle wasted the family fortune, which is why you're currently living in poverty.
You sold my children into servitude. Now you're asking me to pay rent?
Thanks, Uncle Gamlin. You'll meet the rest of your companions as you do your questing to earn gold, each affecting the main story in minor and sometimes major ways. You'll also have to complete that quest that Flemeth asked you to do at the start of the game by taking an amulet to the Dalish Elves, who are very welcoming.
Not expecting tea and cakes. I just need to see someone.
There's nothing here for any human.
On this quest you'll meet up with Meryl and start the trend of not knowing if she's adorable or frightening. Once you finish the quest, Flemeth appears out of the amulet you delivered and says you might have saved her by doing this. She drops a bunch of references to events that might have happened in Origins. Also that she has some unfinished business with Morrigan and that big world changing things are going to happen, but she's very vague on that. Just as it starts to get interesting, she says goodbye and changes into a dragon, only to be seen again in Inquisition. Okay, and another little tangent. Now this Flemeth quest might seem like a nothing little story compared to what's going on, but the writers at Bioware are playing the long game with some of the stories they are setting up in the Dragon Age games, and usually they pay off quite nicely in the future. It's just the setup takes really long and you kinda have to hope they don't forget about the story thread. Like some characters start out as minor ones in past games, then become major ones later in the series. Sandal, this guy right here, I'm pretty sure is one of these characters.
Hello.
I'm also convinced he might be one of the most powerful beings in the Dragon Age universe.
I like enchantment.
Stop looking at me like that, I'm being serious. Okay, enough of the tangent. You get the money you need for the expedition, but a choice gets presented to you to take your sibling with you or not. This choice can affect your sibling's future in multiple ways, and even is affected by which companion you decide to bring with you to the Deep Roads. But let's just say no matter what you choose, your sibling ain't gonna be in the party much anymore. Gotta have that family drama. In the Deep Roads, you fight some Darkspawn and see Sandal flex some of his power. You also find an idol made of red lyrium, which causes trouble almost the instant it's found, as Varric's brother upon touching it betrays you and leaves you to die. But you figure a way out and get rich in the process. The game then cuts to Varric talking to Cassandra, who still thinks Hawk is guilty or something, but Varric says there's more to the story. Skipping 3 years later, this is when Act 2 starts, with Hawk getting a mansion and is now someone of note in the city, with the main story being the Viscount asking you to help keep peace between the city and the Qunari, who I should explain a bit about. Okay, the Qunari, they are generally a race of tall grey-skinned people with horns who believe very strongly in this religion called the Qun. Other races can join the Qunari if they wish, but most see the Qunari as the people with the horns. Their society is very structured around having an order to things. You have a role or job for life, and that's all you do. It's headed by 3 leaders called a triumvirate. One of these leaders, called the Arashok, who leads the Qunari military, has been in Kirkwall since Act 1, looking for a stolen artifact. It wasn't a big issue in Act 1 since they'd been keeping to themselves mostly, but others, mainly a sister of the Chantry called Patrice, has been agitating the Qunari behind the scenes to start a conflict to get rid of them. Her reason being that the Qunari are spreading their teachings in the city, which to her is a big no-no. Now by the time Act 2 starts, the Qunari still haven't found this artifact and Patrice has been stirring the pot a lot more, so open conflict is more likely and you need to try and calm things down. But you're not really going to be able to drastically change the outcome, as things always escalate out of control and the Qunari always attack the city. There's also going to be more family drama that you can't really change either. You might be thinking, well, that doesn't seem like there's many story choices here, and you'd be mostly right. This is where Dragon Age 2 is a bit of a downgrade from from Origins, as you can only slightly affect the main story, but Bioware did give some story choices with the limited development time they had. These choices are mainly how you shape your companions' lives by interacting with them, and sometimes these companions do have an effect on the main story. Like Isabella, remember the artifact the Qunari are looking for? She's the one who stole it from them, and lost it somewhere in Kirkwall, and has been trying to get it back this whole time. Now, depending on your relationship with her, the way the act ends can be a little different, and your choices can lead to her leaving the party forever so she can escape the Qunari.
She's gone. She took it. That bitch.
Or coming back to give the artifact to the Qunari, but even if she does the right thing, the Qunari will rightly want to take her prisoner, which means she leaves your party forever.
What? Oh, no, no, no. If anyone kicks her ass, it's me.
But you can save her if you want to by challenging the Arashock to a 1-on-1 duel. Just be prepared to run around and do tiny bits of damage to him for what feels like forever, while the Arashock heals himself and does nonsense like this. If you have a melee character, enjoy the suffering. Mages have it a little easier with this fight as they can attack the Arashock from distance and slow him with ice abilities. But this fight is pretty bullshit either way, but at least you get praise if you manage to do it, and a slightly graphic statue showing your achievement. Now that the Qunari have been sorted, we cut back to Varric and Cassandra, who is also impressed that you beat the Arashock. Cassandra is starting to get convinced by Varric that maybe Hawke isn't guilty of the vague thing they conveniently keep not mentioning. But as they talk, they mention something happening at the gallows and she wants Varric's version of events. So, fast forward 3 years again and Act 3 starts. The city is still recovering and pretty much leaderless after the Qunari attack, as the Viscount didn't survive the encounter. He was one of the things keeping the Templars headed by Meredith and the mages led by Orsina from going at each other. But with him gone, things have heated up between the mages and Templars, with each accusing the other of worst acts, such as the Templars abusing mages and the mages turning to blood magic to defend themselves. It's a vicious cycle that's getting worse and worse. Even Hawke is having trouble reasoning with them, but the Grand Cleric Althena, the head of the Chantry in the city and the last person in authority above both the Templars and mages, manages to force them to calm down.
Go back to the gallows and calm down, like a good girl.
Though she's more about keeping things as they are than trying to fix the situation, so obviously Hawke tries to help fix this. While doing that, you'll get your last chance to have an influence on your companion stories. You'll have more choice over how those end up than the main story. Like for example Meryl. Depending on your choices you made throughout the game, her clan leader can force her to reconsider her past choices using blood magic. Or her clan can be wiped out by Hawke by a slight misunderstanding. Companions are where most of your story choices will pay off, which isn't as impactful or as big as origin story choices, though I still had fun seeing these choices play out. Now before we continue, just a quick mention about the 2 DLCs for the game. They both add big side quests with interesting characters and stories, while also making combat more interesting and in some cases much harder. You can do the DLCs anytime in the story, but I suggest doing Mark of the Assassin near the end of Act 2. It's a fun high spy story with nice bits of lore if you're into that. The other DLC called Legacy, which has big story implications for Inquisition, I'd suggest you do that in the middle of Act 3. I like the DLC a lot, and looking back at it now after playing Inquisition, the setup for it was quite good. If you pay attention to cutscenes, you get some pretty big hints about the big bad in Inquisition. Okay, back to the main story in Act 3. Hawke wants to sort things out between the mages and Templars, but they want to show how bad each other are, and they each send you on quests to prove it. These quests will give you perspective on both, but also might make you think both sides are wrong, until another argument between Meredith and Orsina gets out of hand. While they argue, a massive explosion at Kirkwall's Chantry kills a whole lot of people, including the Grand Cleric Althena. But what caused the explosion? Well, it was your companion Anders, who during Act 3 could have tricked you into getting the ingredients for that bomb that killed everyone at the Chantry. You little shit. His reasoning is he wants to force a war between the Templars and mages, so all mages have to fight for their freedom from Templars. He gets his wish as this causes Meredith to invoke the right of annulment, which basically means kill all mages on sight in the circle. Oof. After that order, the city just erupts into all-out war between mages and Templars. But before Hawke can deal with that absolute mess, you need to deal with Anders, as you're given the choice of killing him or not for what he's done. For some who might have grown attached to Anders during the story, they could agonize over this choice. For me on the other hand, let's just say Anders won't be in Rush Hour 3. Now the story goes along a linear path after this, the only effect you have in the story being whether your companions stick by you or fight against you. This will be depending if you got a high enough friendship or rival score and which side you choose to fight for, being the Templars or mages. But no matter what side you choose, Orsina will fight you, and the last battle is going to be against Meredith, who sometime during Act 2 was sold that crazy inducing red lyrium idol by Varric's insane brother, and for some reason turned it into a sword, which explains why she's been acting more hostile than usual. Most of the Templars start starts seeing she's gone too far and stopped killing the mages. But this just forces Meredith to go full anime final boss and starts using the red lyrium to do some crazy stuff, like bringing giant statues to life to fight you. As you fight her, she keeps using the red lyrium more and more until it completely consumes her, finally ending the fight, though it's too late to reverse what's been done, as the events in Kirkwall kick off a major rebellion throughout the world, which Hawke was at the center of, but not entirely guilty of causing, according to Varric. Cassandra, who finally has the whole story thanks to Varric, now knows the truth of the events, and we get the final cutscene showing the forces moving into action for the events to come in Inquisition. The ending is okay and does wrap up most story threads, though it's a little vague and leaves you on a bit of a cliffhanger for future events. It isn't as good as Origins with all the different variations on the choices you make in the story, though the lack of different outcomes is pretty much because Bioware had no time left and they just had to make things wrap up as quick as possible, thanks to EA's crazy schedule. Dragon Age 2 is very much a streamlined version of Dragon Age Origins with some attempts to make the gameplay more action-packed, and fix some issues from Origins in an extremely limited time frame for a game of this scale to be made. The game stumbles a bit with the gameplay as it made things a little too simple for Origins fans, but if you've never played an RPG before, it's probably more accessible than most RPGs. Its story, while not as grand as Origins, is still really good and got me invested in the companion stories, which Bioware is still doing a great job with in this game. You still get choices in the story, they just aren't as big and are more about the companions this time around, which would be fine as a standalone game, but as a sequel to Origins, I can understand why some were disappointed by this game. Dragon Age 2 is a good game, just with some flaws and some big expectations from the previous game that it struggles to carry. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Who's the father? Oh, you little...
Are there any good seats left?